The porcelain tea set rattled against the silver tray, a tiny rhythmic sound that felt like a death knell in the silent, marble-floored corridor of the Choi estate. Tiana Hunt gripped the edges of the tray until her knuckles turned a stark ashen gray against her deep mahogany skin. She had lived in this house for 3 years. She knew the cadence of Elias Choi's voice better than she knew her own heartbeat. Usually, his voice was a low, melodic rumble, the sound of silk dragged over gravel. But tonight, standing outside the heavy oak doors of his private study, that voice was a blade. "She is a convenience, Llewellyn. Nothing more." Tiana froze. Her breath hitched, catching in a throat that suddenly felt like it was filled with dry sand. Through the slight crack in the door, she could see the silhouette of Elias, his broad shoulders framed against the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the rain-slicked skyline of Seoul. Beside him stood Llewellyn Kruger, his most ruthless lieutenant, a man whose eyes were as cold as the beretta strapped to his thigh. "The rumors are spreading, boss." Llewellyn's voice was a jagged contrast to Elias's. "The families in the South think you've grown soft. They see the way you look at the girl. They see the way you've moved the security detail to her wing. They think she's your pulse. And in our world, a pulse is just a place to aim the gun." There was a pause. A silence so heavy it felt like it was crushing the lungs out of Tiana's chest. She waited for the denial. She waited for the man who had stayed up with her until 3 a.m. 3 weeks ago when she had a fever, the man who had silently replaced every harsh fluorescent bulb in her quarters with warm, soft amber light because he noticed she squinted in the morning. She waited for that man to speak. Instead, Elias Choi let out a short, hollow laugh that didn't reach his eyes. "You think I would risk an empire for a maid?" Elias stepped closer to Llewellyn, his shadow stretching across the floor like a predatory bird. "Tiana is a tool. She is a shadow that keeps my house in order. If she were to vanish tonight, I would simply hire another with the same skill set. She is replaceable. She is beneath the world I've built and she will never be a part of it. Do not mistake my necessity for sentiment." Tiana felt the world tilt. The scent of Elias's expensive sandalwood cologne, which usually brought her a sense of safety, now felt like a suffocating shroud. The words didn't just hurt, they dismantled her. Every shared glance, every lingering moment where their fingers brushed over a glass of water, every night he sat in the library just to be in the same room while she shelved books, it was all a calculation. Or worse, it was a lie she had told herself. Before we go any further into this heartbreaking journey of pride and hidden passion, I want to say a huge hello to all of you joining us today. It truly warms my heart to have you here in our storytelling community. Whether you're listening while you're commuting, cooking, or winding down for the night, thank you for sharing your time with me. I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I'd love to say hi. And if you haven't already, please do hit that subscribe button and join our family. It helps me keep bringing these intense, emotional stories to life for you. Are you ready? Let's get back to the moment everything changed for Tiana. Tiana didn't drop the tray. Her dignity wouldn't allow it. With a precision born of years of service and a lifetime of being told she had to be twice as good to get half as far, she turned on her heel and walked back down the hallway. Her footsteps were silent on the Persian rugs. She was the perfect ghost he wanted her to be. Back in her small, impeccably clean room in the staff wing, she didn't cry. Not yet. She sat on the edge of her bed, looking at the small framed photo of her mother back in Georgia. She had come here for a fresh start, a way to send money home, and she had ended up falling for a man who lived in the darkness. She had seen the blood on his cuffs. She had heard the whispered orders that ended lives. And she had loved him anyway, believing she saw the soul behind the monster. "Replaceable," she whispered to the empty room. The word felt like a brand. She looked at her hands. They were the hands of a woman who had worked for everything she had. She wasn't a tool. She wasn't a shadow. In the study, Elias Choi stared at the door he knew Tiana was standing behind. He had heard the infinitesimal rattle of the tea set. He knew the exact moment she had arrived and he knew the exact moment she had left. His heart was a frantic, trapped animal in his chest, screaming at him to run after her, to pull her back, to tell her that every word he just spoke was a lie designed to keep Llewellyn's hands, and the hands of every hitman in the city, off her. He had to make her a non-entity. If she was nothing to him, she was safe. If she was his everything, she was a target. Is that clear enough for you? Elias asked Llewellyn, his voice sounding dead even to his own ears. Crystal, boss. Llewellyn nodded, seemingly satisfied. I'll tell the men to stop worrying about the help. As Llewellyn exited, Elias collapsed into his leather chair. He reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a necklace, a delicate gold chain with a single black pearl. He had bought it months ago, waiting for a moment that he now realized would never come. He had built a throne on secrets and fear, but as he sat in the dark, the silence of the mansion felt louder than any gunshot. He had protected her life, but he had just realized he might have destroyed her spirit. And then a soft knock came at the door. Not the rhythmic, familiar knock of a maid bringing tea. This was the knock of a woman who was already gone. Tiana walked in, no tray in hand. She wore her coat, her suitcase standing just outside the threshold. Her face was a mask of professional neutrality, but her eyes, those deep, intelligent eyes that Elias spent his nights dreaming about, were cold. Mr. Choi, she said, her voice steady. I am submitting my resignation, effective immediately. My belongings are packed. I've left the keys on the kitchen island. Elias felt the air leave the room. He stood up slowly, his height usually intimidating, but Tiana didn't flinch. It's 3 a.m, Tiana. You can't leave now. It's raining. I'm replaceable, remember? She said, the ghost of a smile touching her lips, though it carried no warmth. A shadow doesn't care about the rain. And since I'm just a tool, you shouldn't have any trouble finding a new one by morning. Goodbye, Elias. She turned to leave, and for the first time in his life, the great Elias Choi felt the floor vanish beneath him. He wanted to roar, to grab her, to lock the doors and never let her see the sun again if it meant she stayed. But he remained frozen, his own lie a cage of his own making. As she walked out of the mansion, the heavy iron gates groaning shut behind her, Elias stood at the window. He watched her small figure disappear into the gray mist of the city. He had won the war of perception. His men believed he was heartless. His enemies believed he had no weakness. But as the tail lights of her taxi faded into the distance, Elias realized the truth. He hadn't just protected her. He had lost the only thing that made his empire worth ruling. The silence in the house was no longer a peace. It was a vacuum. The question wasn't whether he could live without his maid. The question was, could the man beneath the monster survive the hole she had left behind? And as Llewellyn entered the room again, looking panicked, holding a phone that was vibrating with a high-priority alert, the mystery deepened. Who had seen her leave, and what were they planning to do now that she was no longer under his protection? The rain didn't just fall in Seoul that night. It drowned the neon lights of the Gangnam district, turning the world into a blurred watercolor of blues and grays. As Tiana Hunt sat in the back of the taxi, her small suitcase tucked against her knees like a shield, she watched the fortress she had called home for 3 years shrink into the distance. To understand why a woman like Tiana, a woman who had graduated top of her class in Atlanta with dreams of international linguistics, would end up as a maid to a Korean crime lord, you had to understand the weight of a debt that wasn't hers. Tiana's father, a man with a heart too big for his bank account, had fallen prey to a predatory loan scheme back in the States. When the collectors came knocking with more than just legal papers, Tiana had done the only thing she could. She fled to the one place where her specialized skills and her desire to disappear overlapped. She had been hired by Clara Sterling, the Choi estate's head housekeeper, a woman with silver hair and a gaze that could pierce through armor. Clara had seen something in Tiana, a quiet resilience, a dignity that didn't bow even when scrubbing floors. Tiana wasn't just the help. She was the person who kept the chaos of Elias Choi's life from consuming him. She spoke 4 languages, managed his private library of ancient manuscripts, and knew exactly how he liked his coffee at 4 a.m. when the ghosts of his decisions wouldn't let him sleep. Her deepest desire wasn't wealth or power. It was simply to be seen. Not as a curiosity, not as a servant, but as a woman whose presence mattered. For 3 years she thought she had found that in the silent, stolen moments with Elias. She thought the way he looked at her when he thought she wasn't looking was a promise. Tonight she realized it was just a performance. Inside the mansion the air had turned frigid. Elias Choi stood in the center of his massive empty office, the silence ringing in his ears. He looked at the spot where Tiana had stood just minutes ago. The space felt physically hollowed out. Elias was a man built from scars and cold logic. His father, Arthur Choi, had raised him with a singular, brutal philosophy. A king who loves is a king who provides his enemies with a map to his heart. Elias had spent 34 years perfecting that mapless existence. He had survived 3 assassination attempts, a coup by his own uncle, and the constant grinding pressure of maintaining the Choi syndicate's dominance over the shipping docks. His greatest fear wasn't death. It was weakness. He lived in a world where any sign of humanity was exploited. If the rival clans knew he felt even a shred of affection for the woman who cleaned his house, they would snatch her from the streets before she could scream. He had spent months building a wall of perceived indifference. He had been intentionally cold. He had worked late to avoid her. He had called her staff in front of his men until the word tasted like ash in his mouth. But behind closed doors, the truth was his undoing. He knew Tiana's favorite poet was Langston Hughes. He knew she missed the smell of rain on red Georgia clay. He knew she took her tea with exactly 2 drops of honey, never a spoonful, because she liked the bitterness to linger. He had rearranged his entire security protocol not for his own safety, but to ensure there was always a silent watch on her whenever she went to the market. He had even bought the small bakery 3 blocks away because she once mentioned they had the best almond croissants in the city, ensuring it stayed open just for her. He was a man obsessed, hiding behind a mask of ice. The supporting players. As Elias stared at the rain, the door creaked open. Clara Sterling entered, her face a mask of disappointment. She didn't fear Elias the way the men in the streets did. She had changed his diapers, she knew the boy beneath the boss. "She's gone, Elias," Clara said, her voice soft but heavy with reproach. I watched her walk out into the storm. I've never seen a woman look so small, yet so tall at the same time. "It was necessary, Clara," Elias snapped, though his voice lacked its usual bite. Llewellyn was asking questions. "The board is restless. They were looking for a crack in the foundation. I had to show them there wasn't one." "By breaking her?" Clara walked to the desk, her eyes narrowing. "You didn't just tell a lie to protect her, Elias. You told a lie that confirmed her worst fears about herself. You told her she didn't matter. You think the syndicate is dangerous? Try living with the version of yourself that let the only light in this house walk out the door." Meanwhile, in a dimly lit basement across the city, Llewellyn Kruger was making a phone call. Llewellyn was the personification of the world Elias lived in, tactical, ruthless, and devoid of sentiment. He had been Elias's right hand for a decade, but lately he had begun to wonder if the right hand shouldn't be the one holding the crown. "The girl is out," Llewellyn whispered into the receiver. "He cut her loose. He says she's nothing. But I saw his hands, brother. They were shaking when he said it. He's lying. She's the anchor. If we take the anchor, the ship drifts. Find out where the taxi dropped her off. If she's replaceable, then Choi won't mind if she goes missing for a while." The irony of Tiana's departure was that she was leaving the only person who truly understood the darkness she carried. 2 years ago, Tiana had been cornered in the estate gardens by a drunken associate of the syndicate. He had mistaken her quiet nature for submissiveness. Elias had appeared from the shadows like a vengeful god. He didn't just dismiss the man, he had ruined him. But it was what happened after that stayed with Tiana. Elias hadn't lectured her. He hadn't told her to be more careful. He had simply sat with her on the stone bench for 3 hours in the dark, his hand hovering just inches from hers, offering his presence as a silent shield. "In this world, Tiana," he had whispered that night, "the things we value most are the things we never speak of aloud. Silence is the only safe place for a treasure." She had thought he was talking about her. Now she realized he was talking about his empire. As the taxi pulled up to a small, cramped hostel in a part of the city where the neon lights flickered and the air smelled of exhaust, Tiana stepped out. She felt the cold rain soak through her coat, a stark reminder of her new reality. She was no longer the protected resident of a fortress. She was a woman alone in a foreign land with no job, no protector, and a heart that felt like it had been put through a shredder. She checked into a room that was barely larger than her closet at the Choi estate. The walls were thin and she could hear the muffled sounds of the city outside. The sirens, the shouting, the relentless pulse of a world that didn't care if she lived or died. She sat on the thin mattress and finally the first sob broke through. She didn't cry for the luxury she had lost. She cried for the man she thought existed in those 4 a.m. coffee sessions. She cried for the shadow he had turned her into. Back at the mansion, Elias went to the kitchen. He saw the keys on the island. He saw the tea set she had meticulously cleaned before leaving. And then he saw it, a small handwritten note tucked under the sugar bowl. You were right, Elias. I am a tool. But even a tool knows when it's no longer useful to the craftsman. I hope your empire is enough to keep you warm. Elias crushed the paper in his fist. His phone buzzed. It was a text from an unknown number. A photo. It was a grainy shot of Tiana walking into the hostel, taken from across the street. The text read, "If she's replaceable, then you won't mind if we play with the spare parts." The blood in Elias's veins turned to liquid fire. The game of pretend was over. He had tried to protect her by pushing her away, but in the chess game of the underworld he had just moved his queen into the open. Before we dive into the heart-pounding moment where Elias has to decide if he will burn his world down to find her, I have to ask, have you ever felt like you had to hide your true feelings to protect someone only for it to backfire? It's a devastating position to be in. If you're enjoying the tension so far, please make sure you've liked this video and hit that notification bell. It really helps the channel grow and lets me know you want more of these deep, emotional stories. The silence in the office was no longer the quiet of a leader in control. It was the pressurized stillness of a bomb about to detonate. Elias Choi stared at the glowing screen of his phone, the image of Tiana Hunt standing outside that crumbling hostel burned into his retinas. The graininess of the photo couldn't hide the slump in her shoulders or the way she clutched her suitcase. The only life she had left after he'd systematically dismantled her heart. Klaus Vane, Elias hissed, the name tasting like poison. Klaus Vane was the leader of the Northern Alliance, a man who didn't just want Elias's territory. He wanted to see Elias crawl. Klaus was a sadist who specialized in finding the one thing a man loved and using it as a lever to break his spine. For years, Elias had kept Tiana in a gilded cage, convinced that by treating her like a ghost, he had made her invisible to men like Klaus. He had been a fool. In the underworld, an absence of attention is often more suspicious than a surplus of it. Boss, Llewellyn Kruger stepped into the room, his eyes flicking to the phone on the desk. The elders are calling an emergency meeting. They heard about the girl leaving. They want to know why you let a woman with 3 years of our secrets walk out the door without a cleanup crew. Elias stood up, his chair scraping against the marble floor like a scream. He didn't look at Llewellyn. He walked to the wall-mounted gun rack and pulled down a customized Kimber .45. The click of the magazine locking into place was the only answer Llewellyn got. The girl knows nothing, Elias said, his voice a low, terrifying growl. She cleaned floors and shelved books. If the elders want to talk about security leaks, we can discuss why Klaus Vane has a photographer following my former staff. Elias, wait. Llewellyn stepped in front of the door, his hand hovering near his own holster. If you go after her now, you're confirming everything they suspect. You're telling the whole city that the replaceable Maid is the queen of the Choi Syndicate. You'll be painting a target on her back that no amount of guards can protect. Let her go. If Klaus takes her, it's a tragedy, but it's not a war. If you go for her, it's a massacre. Elias stepped into Llewellyn's personal space, the sheer force of his presence making the larger man flinch. You think I'm going for her because of what she knows? Elias leaned in, his eyes dark with a madness he had kept suppressed for a decade. I'm going for her because the air in this house stopped moving the second she closed that gate. And if Klaus Vane so much as breathes on her, I won't just start a war. I'll end the world. Across the city, in the cramped, humid hallway of the Midnight Sun hostel, Tiana was struggling with the lock on room 402. The air smelled of old grease and cheap cigarettes, a far cry from the lavender and expensive beeswax of the Choi estate. Her hands were still trembling, not from the cold, but from the echoing sound of Elias's voice calling her replaceable. She finally got the door open, but as she stepped inside, she realized she wasn't alone. A man was sitting in the single plastic chair by the window. He was younger than Elias, with bleached blonde hair and a jagged scar running through his eyebrow. He wore a designer tracksuit that cost more than Tiana's yearly salary. This was Jackson Vane, Klaus's younger, more volatile brother. You've got a lot of nerve for a maid, Jackson said, tossing a coin into the air and catching it with a rhythmic clink. Leaving the great Elias Choi in the middle of the night? That's a bold move. Or a very calculated one. Tiana didn't scream. She had spent 3 years around the most dangerous men in Asia, She knew that fear was an invitation to a predator. She stood her ground, her hand still gripping the handle of her suitcase. I don't work for Mr. Choi anymore. If you're looking for him, you're in the wrong place. Oh, I'm exactly where I want to be. Jackson stood up, strolling toward her with a lazy, predatory gait. You see, Elias tells everyone you're just a tool. A shadow. But I've been watching him for months. I saw him buy that bakery for you. I saw him change the patrol routes so you'd never be alone in the garden. Elias Choi doesn't do sentiment unless he's found his Achilles heel. And here you are. Brown, beautiful, and completely unprotected. He doesn't care about me, Tiana said, her voice cracking despite her best efforts. He told his men tonight. I'm nothing to him. Jackson laughed, a harsh metallic sound. Then he won't mind if I take you home to my brother. Klaus has a lot of questions about Elias's shipping routes, and I bet you've heard a lot while you were cleaning those offices. He reached for her arm, but Tiana swung her heavy suitcase with every ounce of strength she had. It caught Jackson in the ribs, sending him stumbling back with a curse. She didn't wait. She bolted back into the hallway, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She took the stairs 3 at a time, the sound of Jackson's shouting and heavy footsteps following her. She burst out of the side exit into the rain-drenched alleyway, her lungs burning. The city was a labyrinth of shadows, and she was a rabbit being hunted by wolves. She turned a corner, her shoes slipping on the wet pavement, and slammed straight into a wall of solid muscle. She let out a short, sharp gasp, looking up, expecting to see Jackson or one of his thugs. Instead, she found herself staring into a pair of familiar, obsidian eyes. Elias. He was drenched, his black wool coat heavy with water, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked less like a billionaire boss and more like a man possessed. His hands came up, grabbing her shoulders, not with the gentle touch she remembered, but with a desperate, crushing grip. Are you hurt? He demanded, his voice raw. Tiana, look at me. Did they touch you? Tiana pushed against his chest, her eyes filling with angry tears. Let go of me. What are you doing here? You said I was replaceable. You said I was beneath your world. Leave me alone. I lied. Elias roared, the sound echoing off the brick walls of the alley. I lied to keep you alive. Do you have any idea what kind of people I deal with? If they knew you were my heart, they would have ripped it out of my chest years ago. The revelation hit her like a physical blow. The first major twist wasn't that he loved her. She had suspected that in her bravest moments. It was the sheer, terrifying scale of the lie he had lived. He hadn't been cold because he hated her. He had been cold because his love was a death sentence. But before she could respond, the headlights of 3 black SUVs swung into the alley, trapping them in a blinding white glare. Elias. Lulin's voice came from behind the lights. We have to move. The veins are closing in, and the elders have just authorized a neutralization order for anyone seen with you. If you take her now, you're officially a traitor to the syndicate. Elias looked at the SUVs, then back at Tiana. He saw the terror in her eyes, the way she was shivering in the rain, and the realization that he had brought the very monster he feared right to her doorstep. I'm not leaving her, Elias said, loud enough for his men to hear. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the velvet box he had been carrying. He didn't offer her a ring, he offered her the black pearl necklace. Put this on, he whispered. It has a tracker. If we get separated, don't take it off. I will find you. No matter where they take you, no matter what they tell you, I am coming for you. Elias, no, Tiana started, but he cut her off with a kiss. It wasn't a movie kiss. It was desperate, salty with rain and tears, and tasted of the years of repressed longing they had both endured. It was a goodbye and a promise all at once. Go with Llewellyn, Elias commanded, shoving her toward the nearest SUV as Jackson Vane and a dozen armed men emerged from the hostile exit. He will take you to the safe house. I have to handle this here. Elias, you can't stay alone. Tiana screamed as Llewellyn grabbed her, practically throwing her into the back of the armored vehicle. I'm not alone, Elias said, drawing a second gun. I'm the boss. And it's time I reminded this city why. As the SUV sped away, Tiana watched through the rear window as Elias Choi, the man who claimed she was nothing, stood alone in the rain, facing down an army for the sake of a maid he was never supposed to love. The tires of the armored SUV screamed against the asphalt as Llewellyn Kruger took a sharp turn into an industrial district that looked like a graveyard of rusted shipping containers and abandoned warehouses. Inside the vehicle, Tiana Hunt was shoved against the leather seat. The cold weight of the black pearl necklace Elias had pressed into her hand, feeling like a leaden brand against her skin. "Where are we going?" Tiana demanded, her voice shaking but her eyes burning with a fierce, newfound defiance. "Elias is back there. He's alone." Llewellyn didn't look back from the driver's seat. His eyes were fixed on the rearview mirror, watching for the headlights of the Northern Alliance, or worse, the Syndicate's own execution squads. "The boss told me to get you to the Sub-Zero safe house. My job is to keep you breathing, Tiana. Elias's job is to make sure there's still a throne to sit on when this night is over. Don't make my job harder than it already is." "He lied to me for 3 years," she whispered, more to herself than to him. "He treated me like a ghost. He watched me scrub his floors while he was planning wars, and he never once thought I deserved the truth." "In our world, the truth is a luxury that gets people killed," Llewellyn grunted. "He didn't treat you like a ghost to insult you. He treated you like a ghost because you can't kill what you can't see. But tonight you became visible. And in Seoul, visibility is a death sentence." They pulled into a nondescript loading bay. The heavy steel door rolled down behind them with a mechanical groan that sounded like a tomb closing. This was the safe house, a high-tech bunker hidden beneath a derelict textile factory. It was cold, sterile, and smelled of ozone and gun oil. The ghost of the past. As Llewellyn busied himself with the security monitors, Tiana paced the small living area. Every shadow seemed to morph into Elias's silhouette. To keep from spiraling into a panic, she let her mind drift back to the moments that now felt like a different lifetime. She remembered a night 6 months ago when a massive storm had knocked out the power to the Choi estate. The backup generators had failed for 30 minutes, plunging the mansion into total darkness. Tiana had been in the library, shelving a rare first-edition collection of Korean poetry. Elias had appeared in the doorway, the light from a single candle illuminating the sharp, aristocratic lines of his face. He didn't look like a boss then. He looked like a man who was desperately lonely. "You're still working," he had said, his voice a low vibration in the small space. "The books don't care about the dark, Mr. Choi," she had replied, her heart racing. He had walked over, taking the book from her hand. His fingers had lingered on hers, a touch that lasted 5 seconds too long to be professional. He hadn't pulled away. Instead, he had opened the book and read a passage in a voice that sounded like a prayer. "The shadow is not the absence of light, but the proof of its intensity." He had looked at her, then really looked at her, and for a fleeting second the mask had slipped. She saw a man who wanted to reach out and pull her into his world, and a man who was terrified that his world would consume her. He had handed the book back, cleared his throat, and reverted to his icy persona. "Finish up and go to your quarters, Tiana. This house is no place for a woman to be wandering in the dark." Now, sitting in the safe house, Tiana realized that every cold word had been a layer of armor he was trying to wrap around her. But the armor had been a cage, and she wasn't sure if she could ever forgive him for the bars he'd built. Back at the alleyway, the scene was a chaotic symphony of violence. Elias Choi was a blur of calculated movement. He didn't just fire his weapon, he used the environment. He ducked behind a dumpster as a hail of bullets from Jackson Vane's men shredded the brickwork above him. He was outmanned 10-1. But Elias wasn't fighting for territory tonight. He was fighting for the woman who had brought the first bit of warmth to his life in a decade. "Is this it, Choi?" Jackson screamed from behind the safety of an SUV. "You're going to die in a gutter for a girl who doesn't even know your middle name? The elders are already voting to replace you. You're a liability now." Elias changed his magazine with a practiced flick of his wrist. "You talk too much, Jackson. Your brother was always the smart one. You're just the noise he makes before he fails." Elias threw a flashbang, the blinding white light momentarily stunning the gunman. He moved like a shadow, taking down 3 men with surgical precision before disappearing into the labyrinth of the hostel's back hallways. He knew he couldn't win a prolonged shootout. He needed to vanish, regroup, and find out who had leaked Tiana's location to the Vanes. He pulled out his secondary burner phone and dialed a number he hadn't touched in years. "Sterling," Elias said when the line connected. "Elias? Where are you?" "The house is crawling with the elders' internal security. Clara Sterling's voice was tight with fear. Listen to me carefully, Clara. Someone inside the syndicate sold Tiana out. They knew exactly where the taxi dropped her. I need you to go to my private study. Behind the portrait of my father there's a drive. It contains the logs of every encrypted message sent from the estate in the last 6 hours. I need to know who spoke to the Northern Alliance. Elias, if they catch me I'm dead, Clara whispered. I know. And I wouldn't ask if I had anyone else. Please, Clara. For Tiana. There was a long pause. I'll do it. But Elias. Llewellyn. He was very quiet when she left. Too quiet. Elias felt a cold chill that had nothing to do with the rain. Llewellyn was with Tiana right now. At the safe house, Tiana's linguistic training kicked in. She couldn't sit still, so she began examining the Sub-Zero facility. It wasn't just a bunker, it was a hub. On a desk in the corner, a laptop was logged into a secure server. Llewellyn was in the other room talking low into a satellite phone. Tiana crept to the laptop. Her fingers flew across the keys. She wasn't just a maid. She was a woman who had spent 3 years organizing the most sensitive documents in the Choi Empire. She knew his filing systems better than he did. She found a folder labeled Operation Obsidian. As she clicked through the files, her blood turned to ice. It was a ledger of payments. Huge sums of money being funneled into an offshore account in the name of T. Hunt. What is this? She whispered. The dates went back 2 years. Every month, a massive deposit had been made. It looked like she was being paid for information. It looked like she was a spy. Suddenly, a hand clamped down on her shoulder. She gasped, spinning around to find Llewellyn towering over her. His face was unreadable. You shouldn't be looking at those, Tiana, Llewellyn said, his voice dropping an octave. Why is there an account in my name, Llewellyn? Why does it look like I'm selling secrets to the Vanes? Llewellyn leaned in, his eyes darting to the security monitors. Because that's the lie Elias built. If the elders ever suspected he was keeping you because he loved you, he needed a backup story. He made it look like you were a high-level asset, a double agent he was running to get intel on the Northern Alliance. He was setting you up to be the villain so you wouldn't be the victim. Tiana shook her head, tears of frustration blurring her vision. He's a monster. He manipulated my entire identity just to keep his hands clean. No, Llewellyn corrected her. He manipulated the world to keep your hands clean. If he dies tonight, that account is yours. It has enough money to buy you a new life anywhere on Earth. He wasn't just protecting you, Tiana. He was planning for a world where he wasn't in it. The weight of Elias's devotion began to crush her. It wasn't a romantic love. It was a desperate, sacrificial obsession. But before she could process the revelation, the security alarm began to wail, a high-pitched, piercing shriek that signaled a breach. They found us, Llewellyn hissed, drawing his weapon. Stay behind me. If the door opens and it's not Elias, you run through the vent in the back. Do you hear me? You run and you don't look back. The steel door of the safe house groaned as something heavy slammed against it. Tiana clutched the black pearl necklace, the metal cold against her skin. She realized then that she didn't want the money. She didn't want a new life. She wanted the man who was currently burning his empire to the ground to keep her safe. She looked at Llewellyn. Is he coming for me? Llewellyn looked at the door, then back at her with a grim smile. He's been coming for you since the day you walked into that mansion, Tiana. He just didn't know it until tonight. The door buckled. A cloud of dust and sparks filled the room. The explosion didn't just take the door off its hinges. It shattered the very air in the safe house. Tiana was thrown backward, her ears ringing with a high-pitched whine that drowned out the world. Through the swirling gray dust and the smell of scorched metal, she saw a figure emerge. It wasn't a squad of Vane's hitmen. It was a single man, his silhouette jagged and swaying. Elias Choi. He was a mess. His expensive wool coat was shredded, soaked through with a mixture of rain and deep blooming crimson. His left arm hung uselessly at his side, and blood smeared his jawline, but his eyes, those obsidian depths, were locked onto Tiana with a terrifying singular focus. Elias! Tiana screamed, finding her feet and rushing toward him, forgetting for a split second the ledger, the lies, and the coldness. He caught her with his good arm, pulling her into the hard, trembling heat of his chest. He smelled of gunpowder, iron, and the cold night air. For a heartbeat, he buried his face in the crook of her neck, a ragged, broken sound escaping his throat. It wasn't the sound of a boss. It was the sound of a man who had stared into the abyss and only found his way back because of the light she provided. "You're here," he rasped, his voice vibrating against her skin. "You're safe. You're bleeding, Elias. You're going to collapse," she cried, trying to lead him to the modular sofa. "I don't have time to bleed," he muttered, but he allowed her to guide him. Llewellyn stood by the monitor, his gun still drawn, his expression a mask of stone. "Boss, how did you get through the perimeter? The Northern Alliance had the alley bottled up." "I didn't go through them," Elias said, his teeth gritted as Tiana began to peel back his coat to inspect the wound. "I went under them. The old subway maintenance tunnels. But they're right behind me. Llewellyn, prep the secondary transport. We're leaving the country tonight." "Wait," Tiana said, her voice sharp as a shard of glass. She stopped her medical ministrations, her hand hovering over his blood-soaked shirt. "Leaving the country? To go where? As what? Your spy?" Elias stiffened. His eyes flicked to the laptop on the desk, still glowing with the details of Operation Obsidian. "Tiana, not now," he whispered. "No, Elias. No. Right now." She stood up, her small frame vibrating with a righteous fury that seemed to dwarf his physical presence. "I saw the ledger. I saw the offshore accounts. You didn't just hire me to clean your house. You used my name, my identity, to create a paper trail of treason. If the law ever catches up to the Choi Syndicate, I'm the one who goes to prison. I'm the double agent who sold out her country. How could you do that to me?" Elias looked up at her, and for the first time, Tiana saw the true depth of his internal conflict. There was no coldness left, only a raw, bleeding vulnerability. "I needed you to be untouchable," Elias said, his voice cracking. "In my world, if you are an innocent, you are collateral damage. But if you are a player, if you are essential to the business, then the elders have to keep you alive. That money, it wasn't a bribe. It was your escape hatch. I never intended for you to go to prison. That account has a clean identity attached to it. A passport. A life. I was building a door for you to walk through the moment I couldn't protect you anymore. You should have asked me," she sobbed. "You should have let me choose. You treated me like a piece on a chessboard, Elias. You said you loved me, you called me your heart in that alley, but you don't even trust me with the truth of my own life. Because the truth is a burden you weren't meant to carry." Elias roared, attempting to stand, though he winced and slumped back. "I am a monster, Tiana. I have spent my life in rooms where people trade souls for territory. I didn't want that for you. I wanted you to keep your light. I thought if I kept you in the dark, the shadows wouldn't touch you. I was wrong. I was so goddamn wrong." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of 3 years of unspoken words. The romance wasn't a fairy tale. It was a tragedy wrapped in silk. He had loved her with a suffocating, protective grip, and she had loved a version of him that he was too afraid to fully inhabit. Suddenly, Llewellyn's phone chirped. A video call. Llewellyn looked at the screen, then slowly turned it toward Elias. It was Klaus Vane. He wasn't in a dark warehouse or a sleek office. He was in the grand foyer of the Choi estate. Behind him, the elders of the syndicate, 6 elderly men in charcoal suits, sat on the hand-carved mahogany chairs that had belonged to Elias's family for generations. "Elias," Klaus smiled, his teeth unnaturally white against his tanned skin. "You look terrible. The subway tunnels haven't been cleaned in years, I see." "How are you in my house, Klaus?" Elias asked, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Tiana's arms stand up. "It's not your house anymore, Elias," one of the elders, a man named Arthur Halloway, spoke up. His voice was thin and cold. "You broke the first rule. You prioritized a personal attachment over the stability of the syndicate. You brought a war to our doorstep for a servant. We have reached an agreement with the Vane family. The Northern Alliance and the Choi Syndicate are merging. Under Klaus's leadership." Elias felt the world tilt. His empire, the thing he had sacrificed his soul to build, the thing he had used as an excuse to keep Tiana at a distance, was gone. In a single stroke, he had been stripped of his title, his protection, and his power. "And the girl?" Elias asked, his grip tightening on Tiana's hand. Klaus leaned into the camera, his expression darkening. "She's a loose end, Elias. And we're in the business of tying them. We know about Operation Obsidian. We know she's your spy. which means she's the only person who can testify against the merger. She's not just a maid anymore. She's a ghost that needs to stay dead. The call ended. Elias turned to Llewellyn. We need to get to the extraction point now. Llewellyn, get the car. But Llewellyn didn't move. He stood by the door, his hands still on his weapon. He looked at Elias, then at Tiana, then down at his own feet. Llewellyn. Elias's voice was a warning. They offered me a seat at the table, boss, Llewellyn whispered, his voice thick with a strange, mournful regret. Klaus. The elders. They said if I stayed with you I'd die in a hole. But if I delivered the girl, I'd be the new head of security for the merged families. Tiana gasped, stepping back, but the safe house was small. There was nowhere to go. You've been with me for 12 years, Llewellyn, Elias said, his voice eerily calm. I treated you like a brother. And you treated her like a god. Llewellyn snapped, finally looking up. His eyes were wet. You stopped being a boss the moment she arrived. You started making decisions based on her safety instead of our profit. You betrayed us first, Elias. You betrayed the world we built for a woman who doesn't even want to be here. Llewellyn raised his gun, pointing it directly at Tiana's heart. I'm sorry, boss. But she has to go. It's the only way the rest of us survive. The air in the safe house was thick with the metallic tang of blood and the bitter scent of ozone from the breached door. Llewellyn Kruger's hand was steady, the barrel of his weapon a dark, unblinking eye aimed directly at Tiana Hunt's chest. For a man who had been a brother-in-arms to Elias for a decade, his betrayal wasn't loud or manic. It was a quiet, bureaucratic transition. Put the gun down, Llewellyn, Elias said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. He tried to stand, his hand clutching his side as blood seeped through his fingers, staining his white dress shirt a deep, visceral crimson. You want the chair? You want the title? Fine. It's yours. Just let her walk. She's not part of this. She is this, Elias. Llewellyn shouted, the first crack appearing in his stoic facade. Every war we're fighting right now is because you couldn't keep your hands off the help. You want to talk about brotherhood? I watched you pass over veteran soldiers for promotions because they looked at her too long. I watched you move $20 million into a shadow account for a girl who doesn't even know how to fire a gun. You liquidated our retirement funds to build her a safe life while we're still bleeding in the streets. Tiana looked from Llewellyn's rage to Elias's desperation. The room felt like it was shrinking, the walls closing in. Llewellyn, please, she whispered, her voice trembling. I never asked for any of this. I just wanted to work. I just wanted to go home. You don't have a home anymore, Tiana, Llewellyn said, his eyes softening with a flicker of genuine pity. The moment Elias Choi looked at you like you were his salvation, he burned your bridge back to the real world. Before another word could be spoken, the safe house monitors flared bright white. A secondary breach. The back wall, the one Llewellyn hadn't been watching, exploded in a shower of brick and mortar. The Northern Alliance hadn't waited for Llewellyn to deliver the girl. Klaus Vane didn't trust traitors any more than he trusted enemies. Smoke grenades hissed, filling the cramped space with a choking gray fog. Tiana coughed, blinded, her lungs burning. She felt a hand grab her arm, rough, gloved and violent. Elias, she screamed, reaching out into the haze. Tiana. She heard the sound of a struggle, the dull thud of a fist hitting bone, the sharp crack of a gunshot, and then a heavy groan. She caught a glimpse of Elias through a rift in the smoke. He had thrown himself toward her, his face contorted in agony as he tackled one of the masked men. But he was too weak. His movements were sluggish, his blood loss finally catching up to him. Llewellyn was engaged in a frantic shootout with Klaus's men, the very people he had tried to bargain with. He had traded his soul for a seat at a table that was already being chopped for firewood. Take her. Move, 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 a voice barked. Tiana felt herself being lifted off her feet. She kicked and clawed, her nails dragging across a tactical vest. She saw Elias reach out, his fingers brushing the hem of her coat before a rifle but slammed into the side of his head. No. Tiana's scream was cut short as a cloth soaked in something sweet and chemical was pressed over her nose and mouth. The world began to tilt. The last thing she saw was Elias Choi lying on the cold concrete floor, his eyes fixed on her, filled with a bottomless, silent apology. Then the darkness rushed in, cold and absolute. The cold cell. When Tiana woke, the first thing she felt was the cold. Not the damp cold of the rain but the deep, biting chill of stone and iron. She was in a cellar, her hands zip-tied behind her back to a rusted pipe. The air was stagnant, smelling of salt and old machinery. Above her, a single flickering bulb hummed with a maddening, uneven rhythm. She was alone. The silence was the worst part. In the mansion, the silence had felt like a secret shared with Elias. Here it felt like a burial. Every fear she had ever suppressed came rushing back. The fear of being disposable, the fear of being a footnote in a powerful man's biography. She had been right to try and leave. She had been right to think she was just a tool. But the memory of Elias's face in the alley, the raw, naked love he had finally allowed himself to show, haunted her. "You're awake. Good." The door at the top of the stone stairs creaked open. Klaus Vane descended slowly, his footsteps heavy and deliberate. He held a tablet in one hand and a glass of amber liquid in the other. He sat on a wooden crate across from her, looking at her as if she were a curious specimen under a microscope. "Elias has very expensive taste," Klaus said, taking a sip of his drink. "I expected a model. A socialite. Someone with a pedigree. But you're just a girl from Georgia who got lost in the wrong city." "Where is he?" Tiana asked, her voice a dry rasp. "Elias? He's exactly where he belongs. In the ruins of his empire." Klaus smiled. "Llewellyn left him in the safe house. By the time the fire department gets there, there won't be enough left of him to put in a jar. He died for nothing, Tiana. He died for a girl who can't even tell me the password to his Swiss encryption." The word died hit her like a physical blow to the stomach. She felt the air leave her lungs. Elias dead? The man who had been the gravity of her world for 3 years was just gone? A sob built in her throat, but she swallowed it down. She wouldn't give Klaus the satisfaction of her grief. "I don't know any passwords," she said, her voice shaking but her eyes holding his. "He never told me anything. I was just the maid." "Then you're of no use to me." Klaus stood up, the light catching the cruel edge of his smile. "The elders want you gone. They want the Choi era erased. No witnesses. No legacies. No ghosts." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small silver lighter. He flicked it open, the flame dancing in the dark. "It's a shame. You're quite beautiful. But in this world, beauty is just another currency and yours just hit zero." Miles away, in the charred, skeletal remains of the Sub-Zero safe house, a hand twitched. Elias Choi opened his eyes. The world was a blur of orange and black. Smoke curled around the ceiling and the heat was becoming unbearable. His head felt like it had been split open with an axe. He groaned, rolling onto his side, his hand brushing against something hard. The velvet box. It had fallen out of his pocket during the struggle. He clutched it, the edges biting into his palm. He looked around the room. Llewellyn was gone. Tiana was gone. His empire was ash. He had no guns, no men, and he was bleeding out on a floor that was rapidly becoming a furnace. He had reached the end. Everything his father had warned him about had come true. He had loved and he had lost everything. He could just close his eyes. The smoke would take him peacefully. He could end the cycle of violence, the lies, and the constant crushing weight of the crown. But then he remembered the tracker. He fumbled with his phone, which had miraculously survived in his inner pocket. The screen was cracked, but it flickered to life. He opened the custom app. A small, steady blue dot was pulsing on the map. The black pearl necklace. He was still wearing it. He was alive. Elias Choi felt a surge of adrenaline that defied the laws of biology. He didn't have an empire anymore. He didn't have a throne. But he had a target. He crawled toward the breached wall, his fingernails digging into the debris. He wasn't the boss anymore. He was a man who had nothing left to lose, and that made him the most dangerous person in the city. "I'm coming, Tiana," he whispered, his voice lost in the roar of the flames. "I'm coming for you." The rain had finally stopped, replaced by a thick, suffocating fog that clung to the ruins of the Sub-Zero safe house. From the jagged hole in the smoking brickwork, a hand emerged, followed by a man who looked like he had crawled out of the very pits of hell. Elias Choi was no longer the pristine, untouchable king of the underworld. His suit was a charred rag, his face was a mask of soot and dried blood, and his breath came in ragged, wet rattles. But as he stood up, swaying on feet that felt like they were made of lead, his eyes were clear. The fire hadn't just burned his empire, It had burned away the lie. He didn't need a throne. He didn't need the elders' approval. He only needed to find the woman who had become his North Star in the dark. He stumbled toward a black sedan parked 2 blocks away, a ghost car he kept for emergencies, unregistered and untraceable. He broke the window with the butt of his empty gun, hot-wired the ignition with trembling fingers, and felt the engine roar to life. He didn't head for the docks or his hidden armory. He headed for the one person in Seoul who still saw him as a human being. The inside woman. Clara Sterling was sitting in the servants' kitchen of the Choi estate, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea that had long since gone cold. The house was full of the Northern Alliance's men, brutal, loud and disrespectful. They had already begun tearing down the paintings and drinking Elias's vintage wine. Suddenly her burner phone vibrated. A single text, the garden gate. 3 minutes. Clara felt a jolt of electricity run through her spine. She stood up, smoothing her apron, and walked with the practiced, invisible grace of a head housekeeper. She slipped out the side door, avoiding the security cameras she knew were being monitored by Klaus's men. In the shadows of the weeping willow near the koi pond she found him. She gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Elias. Oh my God. The drive, Clara, Elias rasped, leaning heavily against the tree. Did you get it? I did. But Elias, you need a hospital. You're dying. I'll die when she's safe, he said, taking the small USB drive from her. Listen to me. Operation Obsidian wasn't just a fake ledger to protect Tiana. I built a kill switch into the syndicate's digital infrastructure 3 years ago, hidden inside that ledger. If I can get to a main terminal, I can freeze every asset the Choi family and the Northern Alliance own. I can turn their billions into zeros in 10 seconds. The main terminal is in the study, Clara whispered. But Klaus is there. He's moved his operations into your father's office. Elias looked at the drive, then at the sprawling mansion he had called home. He's not just there. He has Tiana there. He wants the elders to watch him break the ghost before they finalize the merger. He thinks she has the passwords. He thinks she's the key. She is the key, Elias, Clara said, her voice firm. But not for the reasons you think. She's the only one who can make you fight like this. Elias looked at her, a ghost of a smile touching his bloodied lips. Tell the kitchen staff to start a fire in the West Wing. Small, enough to trigger the smoke alarms but not enough to burn the house down. I need a distraction. And Clara? Thank you. In the soundproofed basement of the mansion, a room Tiana had never seen during her years of cleaning, she was strapped to a chair. Klaus Vane was pacing in front of her, his patience wearing thin. On a screen behind him the elders watched via video link, their faces impassive. Last chance, Tiana, Klaus said, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. The encryption on Elias's private accounts. What is the phrase? We've tried the obvious ones. Your name. His father's name. The date you were hired. Nothing works. Tiana looked up at him. Her lip was split and her shoulder ached where the zip ties cut into her skin, but she didn't look like a victim. She looked like a woman who had finally found her own strength. You think he gave me a password? She asked, a dry chuckle escaping her. You think a man like Elias Choi trusts anyone that much? He loved you, Klaus spat. Men do stupid things when they're in love. He didn't love me with words or codes, Klaus. He loved me with silence, Tiana said. She thought about the 4 a.m. coffee. She thought about the way he replaced the light bulbs. She thought about the poem he read in the dark. The shadow is not the absence of light, but the proof of its intensity. Suddenly it clicked. The password wasn't a name. It wasn't a date. It was the only thing Elias had ever truly shared with her. I'll tell you, Tiana said, her voice steady. But you have to let me speak to the elders directly. I want them to hear it. Klaus smirked, signaling for the audio to be unmuted. Go ahead, girl. Save your life. Tiana looked into the camera. The password is the proof of the intensity. But you should know something. Elias didn't build that system to keep his money safe. He built it to keep his soul safe. And you've already lost yours. Before Klaus could react, the smoke alarms began to wail throughout the mansion. The overhead sprinklers hissed to life, drenching the room in cold water. The heavy steel door of the basement was kicked open. Not by a squad of men. By a single man, drenched, bleeding, and holding a detonator. Get away from her, Klaus, Elias said. The reunion. The sight of Elias standing there, broken but unbowed, sent a surge of pure, unfiltered hope through Tiana's veins. She didn't see the mafia boss. She saw the man who had come back from the dead for her. Elias, she cried. Klaus pulled a gun, aiming it at Tiana's head. One step closer and she dies, Choi. You're a ghost. You have nothing. No men, no money, no power. I have the kill switch, Klaus, Elias said, holding up the USB drive. I just uploaded it through the mansion's wireless network while your men were busy with the fire. Check your tablet. Klaus's eyes flicked to the device on the table. The screen was scrolling with red text. Assets liquidated. Accounts frozen. Total balance, $0. The elders on the screen began to shout, their faces twisting in panic as they realized their fortunes were vanishing in real time. You've ruined us. Arthur Halloway screamed through the speakers. I've freed us, Elias replied. The syndicate is dead. The Northern Alliance is bankrupt. There's nothing left to fight over, Klaus. It's just you and me. In the chaos of the blaring alarms and the pouring water, Elias lunged. He didn't fire a gun. He used his body as a battering ram. He slammed into Klaus, knocking him away from Tiana. The two men crashed into a rack of wine bottles, glass shattering everywhere. Tiana didn't wait. She used the jagged edge of a broken bottle near her chair to saw through her zip ties. Her hands were free. She stood up, her eyes searching the room for a weapon. She found a heavy brass fire extinguisher and, without hesitation, swung it with all her might at Jackson Vane, who was rushing into the room. The blow caught him in the temple and he crumpled. Elias and Klaus were locked in a brutal, primal struggle on the floor. Klaus was fresher, stronger, but Elias was driven by a desperation that Klaus couldn't understand. I'll kill you, Klaus roared, his hands closing around Elias's throat. Tiana didn't scream. She didn't faint. She stepped forward and slammed the fire extinguisher into Klaus's back, breaking his grip. Elias rolled away, gasping for air. He reached out and Tiana took his hand, pulling him up. For a second, amidst the smoke, the water, and the ruins of their lives, they looked at each other. You came back, she whispered. I never left, he replied. But the fight wasn't over. Klaus was scrambling for his gun, and the elders were already calling in their backup squads. They were trapped in the heart of the enemy's fortress. The basement of the Choi mansion was no longer a sanctuary. It was a drowning chamber of steam, blood, and shattered glass. The overhead sprinklers hissed with a relentless, rhythmic violence, turning the floor into a slick, treacherous mirror. Klaus Vane scrambled backward, his face a mask of primal fury, his hand clawing for the silver-plated pistol that had skittered across the wet concrete. You think a digital wipeout changes anything? Klaus spat, his voice cracking with the strain of his ego. I have men in every corner of this city. I have the police in my pocket. You're just a dying man and a maid in a basement. Elias Choi stood between Tiana and the darkness, his body swaying like a tall tree in a hurricane. He didn't look at Klaus. He looked at the black pearl necklace still resting against Tiana Hunt's collarbone. The money was never the point, Klaus, Elias whispered, his voice steady despite the blood bubbling in his lungs. The point was the signal. Suddenly, the monitors on the wall, the ones still displaying the panicked, pixelated faces of the syndicate elders, shifted. The feed changed. It wasn't just showing the basement anymore. It was showing every television screen in the mansion. It was showing the jumbotrons in Myeongdong. It was showing the secure servers of the Global Financial Crimes Unit. The tracker in the necklace wasn't just a GPS. It was a high-frequency transmitter linked to a hidden black box in Elias's study. For 3 years, Elias hadn't just been running a syndicate. He had been documenting it. Every bribe, every shipment, every execution order. All of it had been recorded, encrypted, and waiting for the moment the kill switch was activated. You didn't just bankrupt them, Elias, Tiana whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical wave. You've exposed the entire underworld. I told you, Tiana, Elias said, turning to her, his obsidian eyes softening for the briefest of seconds. I wanted to build you a door. But to make sure you were truly safe, I had to burn the whole house down so no one could ever follow you. Traitor! Klaus roared, lunging forward with a jagged shard of a wine bottle. Elias tried to move but his leg buckled. Tiana didn't hesitate. She didn't wait to be rescued. She grabbed the heavy brass fire extinguisher again, but this time she didn't just swing it. She pulled the pin and aimed the nozzle. A thick, white cloud of chemical foam erupted, blinding Klaus mid-lunge. As Klaus stumbled, coughing and flailing, Elias found the strength for one final, decisive movement. He stepped into Klaus's space, delivering a clinical, powerful strike to the man's throat, followed by a sweep that sent the Northern Alliance leader crashing into the heavy metal server rack. The impact sparked a secondary electrical fire, and Klaus slumped to the ground unconscious. The final betrayal or redemption. The door at the top of the stairs burst open. A silhouette stood framed by the orange glow of the fire consuming the upper floors. Llewellyn Kruger. He held a tactical rifle, his gaze sweeping the room until it landed on Elias and Tiana. Elias pulled Tiana behind him, his hand reaching for a weapon that wasn't there. Llewellyn, Elias said, his voice a gravelly command. If you're going to do it now. But let her go. The police are 10 minutes away. The data is already global. There is no syndicate left to lead. Llewellyn looked at his old friend, the man he had betrayed for a promise of power that had turned to ash in less than an hour. He looked at Tiana, who was staring at him not with fear, but with a profound, heartbreaking disappointment. The elders offered me everything, Elias, Llewellyn said, his voice hollow. But they forgot one thing. I was a soldier before I was a traitor. Llewellyn turned his weapon away from them and aimed it at the staircase. There's a service tunnel behind the wine racks. It leads to the drainage canal. My car is parked at the exit. The keys are in the visor. Llewellyn. Elias gasped. Go, boss, Llewellyn said, not looking back. I'll hold the hallway until the smoke takes over. It's the only way the Shadow and the King get to see the sun. Consider it my resignation. Elias hesitated for a heartbeat, then nodded. He grabbed Tiana's hand, his grip fierce and grounding. They stumbled through the hidden door behind the wine racks just as the sounds of shouting and gunfire erupted from the hallway above. Llewellyn was making his final stand, not for a throne, but for a shred of the honor he had discarded. The tunnel was cramped, smelling of moss and ancient stone. Elias was growing heavier with every step, his weight leaning more and more on Tiana's slight frame. Keep your eyes on me, Elias, she commanded, her voice a lifeline in the dark. We're almost there. You are not dying in a sewer after surviving all of that. Do you hear me? I hear you, he wheezed. Tiana, the accounts. The key hunt account. It's still active. The kill switch didn't touch it. It's clean. You can go anywhere. I'm not going anywhere without you, she snapped, her tears finally falling hot and fast. You don't get to make decisions for me anymore. We're going to get out and we're going to find a doctor, and then I'm going to yell at you for at least a week. He let out a weak, genuine laugh. Only a week. I figured I'd earned a month. They burst out of the tunnel into the cool night air. The rain had started again, but it felt different now, cleansing rather than suffocating. Llewellyn's car was there, a nondescript black sedan. Tiana shoved Elias into the passenger seat, ignoring his protests, and jumped into the driver's seat. As she sped away from the burning Choi estate, she looked in the rearview mirror. The mansion, the fortress of secrets, the place where she had been a maid and he had been a monster, was a pillar of fire against the Seoul skyline. The empire was gone. The money was gone. The names that had terrified the city for decades were being scrolled across news tickers as fugitives. But in the quiet of the car, Elias reached over and took her hand. His palm was scarred, his knuckles were bruised, and he was covered in the soot of his past life. I'm sorry, Tiana, he whispered. For the lie. For the 3 years I wasted being a king when I should have just been a man. The king is dead, Elias, she said, her voice steady as she navigated the car toward the outskirts of the city, toward a small, private clinic she knew he kept off the books for his men. And honestly, I think I like the man much better. The most surprising twist wasn't the data leak or the hidden accounts. It was the fact that the most powerful man in the underworld had found his greatest strength the moment he became powerless. 6 months had passed since the night the sky over Seoul turned orange with the death of an empire. The air here, in a quiet coastal village tucked away on the edge of the Amalfi Coast, didn't smell of rain-slicked asphalt or gunpowder. It smelled of blooming lemon groves, salt spray, and the rich, roasted aroma of coffee from the small cafe at the bottom of the cliff. Tiana Hunt stood on the terrace of a small, whitewashed villa, her hair catching the golden light of the Mediterranean sun. She wasn't wearing a black and white uniform anymore. She wore a flowy silk sundress the color of a summer sunset, and her feet were bare against the warm stone. In her hand she held a book, not a ledger of shipping routes or a collection of poetry she had to shelf for a master, but a manuscript of her own. She had spent the last 3 months translating ancient Korean texts into English, finally using the degree she had once thought would be wasted in service. She heard the rhythmic thump-tap of a cane against the terrace floor. She didn't have to turn around to know who it was. The cadence of his movement was a song she knew by heart. Elias Choi stepped out into the light. He looked different. The sharp, predatory edge of his jaw had softened, and the constant vibrating tension that had once defined his posture had settled into a quiet, sturdy grace. He wore a simple linen shirt, the top few buttons undone, revealing the faint, silver lines of scars that told the story of a man who had survived a war. His left arm moved with a slight stiffness and he leaned on a silver-headed cane, but his eyes, those once obsidian depths, now reflected the blue of the sea. He walked up behind her, not stopping until he was close enough for her to feel the heat radiating from his chest. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. He simply reached out and rested his hand on the small of her back. It wasn't the touch of a boss checking a tool. It was the touch of a man anchoring himself to the only world that mattered. "The village elders are asking about you again," Elias said, his voice now a warm, low rumble that felt like a caress. "They want to know if the American scholar is going to join the festival tonight." Tiana smiled, leaning her head back against his shoulder. "And what did the retired businessman tell them?" "I told them my wife was busy finishing a chapter," he whispered, pressing a kiss to the crown of her head. "But I might be able to bribe her with a walk by the water if the moon was bright enough." Their journey to this peace hadn't been easy. The first 2 months had been a blur of sterile clinics, whispered conversations with lawyers who specialized in disappearing, and the constant gnawing fear that the shadows of Seoul would find them. But Elias's kill switch had been more effective than even he had imagined. The data leak hadn't just bankrupted the Northern Alliance and the Syndicate. It had triggered a global investigation that kept the survivors of the underworld too busy fighting for their legal lives to worry about a dead boss. Klaus Vane and the elders were currently residing in a high-security facility, their names synonymous with the greatest fall in criminal history. And then there was Clara Sterling. Tiana had insisted they find her. They had moved her to a quiet estate in the English countryside, where she lived as a grandmother in residence, finally free from the burden of keeping a monster's secrets. She sent Tiana letters every week, filled with recipes and reminders to make sure Elias ate his vegetables. But the hardest part of the transition hadn't been the physical danger. It had been the emotional reconstruction. For weeks after they arrived in Italy, Elias had struggled to be nothing. He would wake up at 4 a.m. pacing the villa looking for enemies that weren't there. He didn't know how to exist without a throne to defend. Tiana had been the one to lead him out of that darkness. She hadn't done it with grand gestures, but with the very thing he had denied her for years: the truth. "You don't have to protect me anymore, Elias," she had told him one night when the nightmares were particularly loud. "You don't have to be the monster to keep the world away. I'm here because I chose you. Not the boss. You." It was the first time she had seen him cry. Not a sob, but a single silent tear that broke the last of the ice around his heart. Back on the terrace, Tiana turned in his arms, looping her hands around his neck. The black pearl necklace was gone, replaced by a simple gold band on her finger that matched the one on his. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked softly. "The power? The way people looked at you when you walked into a room?" Elias looked out over the ocean where the fishing boats were beginning to head out for the evening. He thought about the marble floors, the armored cars, and the cold, hollow weight of the gun in his hand. Then he looked back at Tiana, at the light in her eyes and the peace in her smile. "I spent 34 years being feared," Elias said, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I realized I'd rather be loved by one person who actually knows my name than feared by 1,000 people who don't. I didn't lose an empire, Tiana. I traded a cage for a life." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of paper. It was the note she had left him the night she tried to resign. It was wrinkled and faded, but he had kept it every single day. "I hope your empire is enough to keep you warm," he read aloud, his voice thick with emotion. He looked at her, his eyes shining. It wasn't. It never was. You were the only thing that ever kept the cold away. He took her hand, leading her toward the stairs that spiraled down toward the beach. As they walked, the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of violet and gold, the colors of a new beginning. They reached the sand, the water lapping gently at their feet. The world behind them was a memory of fire and stone, but the world in front of them was wide, open, and filled with a quiet, enduring hope. Tiana looked at the man beside her. The man who had publicly denied her, who had lied to protect her, and who had ultimately broken every rule of his world to claim her. He wasn't her boss. He wasn't her protector. He was her partner. "The shadow is not the absence of light," she whispered, quoting the poem that had once been their only bridge. Elias smiled, pulling her close as the first stars began to twinkle over the Mediterranean. "It's the proof of its intensity." In that moment, under the vast, quiet sky, the maid and the mafia boss were gone. There was only Elias and Tiana, two souls who had found their way through the darkest of nights to find a morning that would never end. They stood together on the shore, watching the tide come in, a reminder that while empires rise and fall, and while shadows may grow long, the light always finds a way to break through for those brave enough to reach for it.